Well, you can tell a lot about a culture by who their heroes are. What does that say about our culture? When you think of heroes, for most people, the first thing that comes to mind are fictitious people, superheroes, people that don't even exist. And if you pressure people into, no, okay, you got to give me like a real live person as your hero, probably the most common place in our society people are going to go are to sports and athletes. And I'm probably as big a sports fan as anybody in this room, and there's things that they can do that inspire us from time to time. But reality check, they may do things in the clutch when their back's against the wall, but at the end of the day, they're millionaires getting paid lots of money to play a game. They're not actually heroes. Or even as you take another step in our culture, people will hold up celebrities or people like actors who not only do they not do real, at least somewhat real things like sports, it's entirely pretending, right? That's who our society has as heroes. We need better heroes in our culture. And that's where the Bible gives us better heroes. I mean, first and foremost, as believers, we look to Jesus Christ. When you think, what is a hero? Well, someone that inspires, someone that is a model, someone that you want to follow in their footsteps and their example. We've already seen in Philippians, ultimately for us as Christians, that's Jesus Christ. But the Bible gives us many others that it specifically puts out there as an example for us. Earlier this service, intentionally, we read from Hebrews 11, where we read about Abraham and Sarah, and it goes on to speak of Moses and others, people who sometimes are referred to as heroes of the faith. Those are the people that we should look up to and say, well, what is it that they did? Why did they do that? How did they live? And that's the example that I want to follow. That's the example that I want my kids to follow. This is what we need more of. And I want to add one more name to that list of heroes of the faith this morning, except it's a name that's not in Hebrews 11. It may even be a name that some of you have never heard of, or if you have, you haven't really thought much about this guy. And to learn about him, let's go to Philippians chapter 2 this morning, where we'll look at verses 25 through 30 together. And you'll see even on your note sheet a couple times there's the word value, because who your heroes are and what they do, it shows what you value. And I want us to think about what we value today. And even a couple words we'll use along with that is praise. We want to, these values that we have, we want to praise them when we see them in other people. When you see other people doing these things, and that's what I want to praise. I want to say, hey, look at that. That's a good job. Or to say thank you or an encouragement. And they're not only what we want to praise in others, they're the values that we want to prize in our own hearts and seek to build and to foster in our own hearts. Last week we saw Timothy and Paul and their example of genuine care. This week we're going to meet a guy named Epaphroditus. And in case last week you were tempted to think, well, I ain't no Paul and I ain't no Timothy, these famous biblical characters. Well, this is all we know about Epaphroditus. And for all we know, he was just a guy in the church there in Philippi. But today we'll see what it says about him. Follow along as I read verses 25 through 30 in Philippians 2. It says, I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he was longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him. And not only on him, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men. For he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So again, notice the end. The only two imperatives in this passage are there in verse 29. And it's, hey, receive this guy. How? In the Lord with all joy. Celebrate his return and honor such men. Hey, basically, when Epaphroditus gets home, give him a hero's welcome, right? That's what you should do for him. And so then we need to say, well, why does he get a hero's welcome? Well, what we learn from this passage is it refers to him as a messenger there in verse 25. There's 5 things that describe him. The first 3 are Paul is saying he's my brother, my fellow worker, my fellow soldier, but then he's your messenger and minister to my need. You'll see this more in chapter 4, but it's clear the Philippians had sent a gift to Paul. Paul's in prison. They sent a gift to him to help support him. He still had to pay for everything himself, even though he's in prison. So they're supporting him there. And Epaphroditus apparently was the messenger who delivered the gift. But somewhere on this journey to deliver this gift, it's very clear that Epaphroditus gets very sick. So sick he was near to death. And that somehow in completing this mission, he risked his life. But what we see, though, really in how this is described, it seems to be, well, this is fitting. This is the kind of person that Epaphroditus is. He's a brother. He's a fellow worker. He's a fellow soldier. You don't get the sense of, can you believe Epaphroditus actually did this? Whoever saw that coming, right? That's not the sense you get. You get the sense, this is who Epaphroditus is. He's a worker. He's a faithful guy. And when put to the test, he came through and he got the job done. And now I want to send him back to you. Even if the plan was for him to stay longer because he was sick and because you guys, somehow it doesn't tell us how, they knew he was sick, but they didn't know what happened because of the grief this has caused. You guys need to be back together. He needs to be back with the people that he loves after this experience. But he is held up as a faithful servant of Christ. Let's put this down for point number 1. Value faithful service to Christ. Value faithful service to Christ. And just look again at those first 3 words or phrases that Paul uses to describe Epaphroditus. He has a very Greek name, so it's likely he wasn't a Jewish guy. But Paul describes him as my brother, a fellow worker, and fellow soldier. Paul says he's my brother. This guy is family. And that's a good reminder for us. The people around you in this room today, if they are in Christ and you are in Christ, you're brothers, you're sisters, you are family. That's the mindset that Paul had towards him. But this guy, he was a fellow worker. And even that word of work, it implies discipline. It implies faithfulness. And this guy isn't just, hanging out at the church. He's a worker at the church. And we're working together, a fellow worker. There's a Greek prefix that's used a lot in the book of Philippians, kind of like we would say co-laborer. That Greek version of that has been used all throughout the book of Philippians because it's emphasizing a lot of things. We're not just ministers, we're not just workers, we're doing it together for the sake of the gospel. And then he refers to him as a fellow soldier. He's a brother in arms. We've battled together, and even the idea of a soldier, it implies not just that we've worked together, but that we've fought side by side together. We've fought shoulder to shoulder. And a soldier, it includes this idea of there's been suffering involved. There's been sacrifice involved. And that's the kind of person that Epaphroditus is. It's also interesting, Paul doesn't say, he's, been a good subordinate soldier. No, he's a fellow soldier. He's on the same level. And we see even just in the longing in verse 26, he's really concerned for the people that he loves in Philippi who now know he's in danger, he's in trouble, and they don't know what happened. Last week we talked about how Timothy, he genuinely cared about others. Well, here we see that same attribute at work in the life of Epaphroditus. And ultimately, this shows himself in what Paul refers to at the end as him risking his life. And we're going to get to that more in a minute, but I want to start here because this is the foundation. Again, you don't get the sense that, whoa, Epaphroditus sacrificing in a risky way for the gospel, so out of character. You get the sense of, well, of course that's what he did because that's the kind of person that he is. He was a worker. He was a soldier. He was a faithful servant in the church. And that's where we should start. If this guy's a hero, if this guy, that attribute is something we should value, let's start there. I want to praise faithful service. And I want to encourage you to do that. There's a lot of faithful servants at this church. I hope you, in a right way, praise them, encourage them, thank them, even teach your kids, hey, there's a lot of stuff that goes into these people work really hard to set this up and to run this. We should praise that. Praise those things, and that's what we want to prize. I want to be a fellow worker. I want to be a fellow soldier. And we think of sports, and in ways sports has analogies to life and even to the Christian life or to a church. And sometimes we think of, hey, we're a team together. Well, where that analogy breaks down is any sport you watch on TV, there's people on the field and there's people on the bench. Guess what? There is no bench in the church. There shouldn't be. We should all be in the game. And that's where I want to encourage you. Don't be a bench player here at Compass Bible Church. Find something to do and do it faithfully as an expression of genuine care for others. And even if you feel like that thing that you're doing is small, well, it's great. Still, start there. Because Jesus, even in Matthew 25, in a scene of judgment, and he's saying, hey, you guys, you're rewarded, and you guys have done what is right, because when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was in prison, you visited me. And when I was naked, you clothed me. And they said, we never saw any of those things, Jesus. And he said, when you did it for one of the least of these, you did it for me. And so what makes your service important at this church is not what you are doing. It's who you're doing it for. That's what makes it important. Because there is no hierarchy of, well, if you're on the worship team, that's really important. But if you're on the setup teardown team, well, that's not really that big of a deal. No, if you're doing it for Christ, it's a really big deal. And do it faithfully. And even when it's hard, do it for the sake of the Lord. And even parents in the room, to praise and to prize this, model this for your kids. Show them serving the Lord is not a burden, it is a joy. It is a gift to serve God. Make sure that's what is not what's just being said, but what is being shown by your attitudes to the next generation. Find something to do. Get the job done, no matter how big, how small, how unglamorous, and do it faithfully. Now, again, the job here now got into something pretty serious. And that's what I want to spend most of our time talking about, because that's the thrust of even the command to honor him. Why? Because he risked his life. And there's many layers to this. Even going and visiting a prisoner, that was a risky thing. Why was Paul in prison? For his faith. You go to visit somebody that's in prison for their faith, and guess what? Now you're on the watch list, right? Now you are a suspect. You are a person of interest. Oh, you're hanging out with this guy that's so sketchy because of his religion. He's in jail. What does that say about you? So even it was an inherently risky task. Travel in those days was much more risky than it was today. And somewhere along the line, he gets sick. And so it all adds up to Paul saying he almost died and he risked his life for the gospel. Therefore, you need to give him a hero's welcome. Receive him with joy, all joy, and honor him for the reason he nearly died for the work of Christ. But we need to also value risk for the sake of Christ. Now, what is risk? Even how we define it, there's a sense of, there's no guarantee. There's a chance things might go one way or a different way. There's no sure outcome. Or another way people define risk is as exposure. You're exposing yourself to danger or loss. And Paul is saying, hey, this guy exposed himself to danger and loss for the sake of Christ. And you should honor people like that. You should value risk. Let's put it this way for point number 2. Value sanctified risk for Christ. Value sanctified risk for Christ. Now, this is not all risk. Gambling is a risk, and not one, frankly, that I would encourage you to participate in. And when there's a lot of foolish things you could do that are risky, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about risk when someone exposes themselves to danger or loss for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of ministry, for the sake of Christ. And it says there, a command in verse 29 is that such men who do that are to be honored. Honor people that take risks for Christ. Well, what can that look like? Well, start by reading the Bible. Hebrews 11 is a reminder the Bible is full of examples of people who took risks for the sake of God. Going all the way back to somebody like Abraham. He went out not knowing where he was going. To somebody like Epaphroditus. Another thing I would encourage you, even if you take your note sheet and you flip it over, all the recommendations today are really Christian biographies. I would encourage you, read or listen to Christian biographies. Fill your own mind, fill your homes with the stories of those who have taken risks for the gospel. And we're entering the holiday season. Maybe some of you guys will be traveling. A lot of those books even recommended make great audio books. Listen to those. Stir up your own faith with stories of people like Hudson Taylor, who left his life in England to live a life of risk in China to bring people the good news of the gospel. Spend more time valuing that than just whatever other interest you may have in your life. Even now, people that are doing this right now, pray for missionaries. Our main missionary partner as a church is the Hurley family in Uganda. Doing ministry in Uganda is an inherently risky thing. It's just kind of a much more unstable society. There's been an Ebola outbreak there over the last month. It's just a wild place to be and to serve. And they left a pretty successful life in business here in the States to go and do that. We should honor people like that. And we should value that. Or even somebody from our own church right now is over there. John Sanborn is over there helping them do construction. We should be, I hope you pray for him while he is over there. And honor people that, hey, I'm going to sacrifice my time and go and serve even in a risky way for the sake of the gospel. So we can start by honoring the examples that we see of this, but also we want to develop that same kind of mindset in our own lives. And just to be frank, we're all called to risk. There is no such thing as a Christian life without risk or sacrifice. The Christian life exposes you to risk and danger and loss. Jesus said, hey, you want to be my disciple? Take up your cross and follow me. Paul says, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. So there is no such thing as a Christian life that involves no risk at all. But there are some times where that risk gets elevated. And I think that's largely outside of our control. The times where we get to risk our lives, we don't necessarily get to schedule that or decide that. I mean, Epaphroditus, he didn't choose to get sick. Sure, there was an inherent risk to volunteering to go on this trip, but he didn't choose to get sick and to press through that. That was something that God orchestrated. Or even there's moments in history where somebody has to take a stand and we don't always get to choose that. A good biblical example of that would be Esther, right? Who now finds herself in this situation where she has to risk her life by going into the king. And Mordecai encourages her, maybe you were put on the world for such a time as this, right? She didn't choose that. God orchestrated that, but she responded by taking that risk, saying, hey, I'm going to go in and see the king in that memorable line, and if I perish, I perish, right? That's risk. But those moments we don't necessarily get to choose. I can't just say, all right, let's look at this example, and the clear application is everybody go out and risk your life this week for the gospel. You know, how exactly would you do that? What would that look like? But what I would like us all to do is to value that sanctified risk, to praise it in others, and to prize it and to cherish that in our own hearts. And so what might that look like to prize that in your life this week, or even to practice that in smaller ways to prepare yourself for a moment that God may orchestrate in your life where it's a much bigger way? How do you build the risk muscles of your faith, so to speak? Just pastorally, I want to give you 7 ways to build those risk muscles. This isn't an extensive list, but 7 seemed like a good biblical number, so we're going to go with that. The first one is something we've kind of already discussed this morning. Build those risk muscles by serving. Build your faith and your risk by serving others. Because a lot of times, reasons we don't serve is, well, that might expose me to loss or put me in an uncomfortable place. If I really commit to serving at this thing every Thursday night, how am I going to get all of this other stuff done? I don't know. But sometimes it's that risk of, well, I'm going to commit to doing that and trust that God will help me figure things out. And I would encourage you, even as you serve the church, stretch yourself. Do things that don't exactly feel comfortable. Maybe even commit to more than you are totally sure how it's going to work out. And see how God provides. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody has to do everything. No, we can't do that. And there is a time to cut back. But even that cutting back shouldn't be so much, well, I need to protect myself. No, I'm trusting God to do that. It's more, I need to make sure I'm doing what I'm doing well. And I can't do everything maybe sometimes and do it all well. So I have to focus on something that I can do well. But it's not just a self-preservation that motivates us. We stretch ourselves in those risk muscles by serving. A second way to build those things in our hearts is through evangelism. Evangelism is another way. We're wrapping up an evangelism class that we've been doing out throughout the fall with the church. And the first class I taught on the reasons why we should evangelize. And we started the discussion, well, let's just be honest. Why don't we evangelize? And the first answer to put up on the board was pretty easy because pretty much everybody said it at the same time. Fear, right? We all know it. Because evangelism, it feels risky to us. There's an exposure there. I'm putting my faith out there. I'm speaking the truth, but I don't know how it's going to be responded to. And maybe I'm a little scared of how they might respond to it. What is the reaction going to be? And that's where I want to encourage you, stretch those risk muscles by putting it out there more, speaking the truth more often. And even you'll grow a lot more as an evangelist by doing it than by not doing it. That might be shocking, right? Do it and you'll learn because you'll say, okay, I said this thing and maybe that was a little too strong. Maybe that was a little too confrontational and it set the person back. Maybe I should try something different. You'll learn more from that than, well, I didn't say anything and maybe next time I should say something, right? You'll get better at, well, I can say this instead of that when you're actually saying something. But to do that, you have to take a risk. And of course, there's a time to be shrewd. Jesus said, as he was training evangelists, be shrewd as serpents. And even Jesus, there was times where he didn't give a straight answer, but that's when it was clear the questions, they're not being asked in good faith. And I'm not ducking the question to preserve myself. I'm doing it actually to have mercy on my hearers because they're barking up the wrong tree. They're saying things they shouldn't say, and it's not helpful for them. Stretch your faith through evangelism. A third way to build these muscles is through giving. Giving your money, your resources away, whether that's to the church, whether that's through being hospitable to others or just generosity to others, that's always risky because there's no guaranteed return on your investment. You're not getting that money back, and when you use it to serve others, sometimes they might not respond the way that you want. Your hospitality may not be received with thanks, or there's many ways. It's a sacrifice. And I want you to think about what you're giving up. Even those of you don't even really think about your giving to the church because it's, gets deducted from your bank account once a month and you've set that up. That's fine, by the way. But every once in a while, remember what you're doing and even think, this is how much I'm giving. What else could I be doing with that? Not to covet that thing, but to be saying, no, I could be doing this, but I'm gladly choosing not to. I'm willing to expose myself to the loss of these things for the sake of Christ. A fourth way to build these muscles is through obedience. Obedience. And this, I think some expressions of obedience more than others, you see this, where the reason we don't obey is because we are afraid. We're exposed to risk. And that's why I say good examples of this would be evangelizing and giving. Those things are commanded. But sometimes the reason we don't is we're afraid. But we need to obey in those things and push through. Another example would be what we've seen in Jeremiah. If you've been reading through the Bible with us, we just finished up the book of Jeremiah, and man, it gets frustrating at the end of the book. Because Jeremiah is telling them the truth, and you're like, yeah, Jeremiah. Oh, guys, listen to Jeremiah. Please listen to Jeremiah. And they never listen to Jeremiah. It's a sad, sad story. And even in the end, when the Babylonians have Jerusalem surrounded, and he's telling the king, hey, surrender, go out to the Babylonians, and you will make it out of here unharmed. And you're saying, yeah, listen to Jeremiah, listen to the prophet. But the king says, no, I'm not going to do that. And he even says, why? I'm not going to do that because I'm afraid. I'm afraid of the people who have already gone out to the Babylonians, and I'm afraid that they'll do something bad to me. And Jeremiah says, don't be afraid of that. God will take care of you. But he doesn't listen. He doesn't obey because he is afraid. And now, again, you're not a king of Jerusalem. There's no Babylonian army. But here's some ways that may show up in your life. It may be an issue of conscience at your job, where you feel like this is the right thing to do. But you know if I do this, or maybe it's if I don't do this thing I'm being pressured to do, what's going to happen? Will I get fired? Will I get passed over for the promotion next time? Will I be ostracized? I'm exposing myself to danger or loss because I'm sticking to what I think is right. That's a good example of how obedience will build these muscles. Or even financial integrity. Just saying, hey, I'm going to do the right thing even if it feels like it costs me. I'm not going to fudge these numbers for my taxes just to save a few bucks. No, God can provide more than that for me. I'm going to do what I think is right in the eyes of God and let the chips fall where they may. Because the chips don't just fall where they may, they fall exactly where God wants them to fall. And I'm going to trust that. So there may be ways you need to take steps of obedience right now that may be smaller steps than risking your life. But there are ways God will build this in you. Hear me out on this next one. Number 5 is family. Family. And just think through this as we look out at our society. Marriage is in decline. Less people are getting married, and if they are, it's much later. Childbearing is in decline. Fewer people are having kids and fewer numbers of kids. And that's a whole other topic. There's a whole variety of reasons, but I think one of the reasons is people are unwilling to take risks. That's part of the reason why. Marriage is a risk. Committing yourself to one person for the rest of your life, that's a risky thing if you understand it right. That's a big commitment that shouldn't be taken lightly. Having children in this world, yeah, that's a risky thing. Now, I've seen our kids' ministry statistics. I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit on this one. There's a lot of kids in this church. And I'm not saying, please, I'm not trying to oversimplify this and say, hey, the only right answer is always to get married and have as many kids as you possibly can. I am not saying that. I'm just saying we need to push back on the total risk-averse view of our culture that says, oh, you probably really shouldn't have any kids. And if you do, you better make sure you have saved up enough money to pay for everything that child is ever going to do their whole life before you think about having one, right? Well, where is that? That's not biblical, faith-filled thinking, right? We need to think differently based on God. And that's where there's a whole flip side to that, because maybe you even look at the Apostle Paul and say, well, he wasn't married, he didn't have any kids, and he said, I wish everybody was like me. What about that? Well, that's a risk in and of itself. Singleness can be a risk for the sake of Christ. Saying, I'm going to forego the traditional stability and joys of family or children for the sake of the gospel. And I'm going to trust that God's going to make up for those things that I feel like I might lose out on. And again, there's a lot of things that could be said, and there's other things that touch on this. I'm just saying, let's push back against the total safe-minded, I've got to have it all figured out mindset of our world. No, you don't. And that's where sometimes if it's, well, should I take this step of faith or not? But we need to trust that God will help figure it out. And even within marriage, why does it often break down? Why are marriages often struggling or not healthy? Because people are afraid of taking risks. Because doing what God has called you to do, which if you're married is basically lay down your life for your spouse, if you're doing that with no guarantee, well, I'm supposed to do that regardless of how they're responding to me, yes, that's what the Bible teaches. That's risky. That's exposing yourself, right? That's what God calls us to. And that's why it breaks down, because, well, I will do what God's calling me to do when I feel like the other person is doing what God is calling them to do. That's not how it works. That's actually literally how it doesn't work, right? That's how it breaks down. But to say, hey, I'm going to love my spouse no matter what, that's risky. That's faith. Build those muscles. A sixth way is work. We can build our faith, our risk muscles, through work. Ecclesiastes 11:4-6 says, "He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good." Right? It's saying you can't wait for the perfect conditions, even in your work, to do anything. You're going to have to take some chances. Whatever you do as a vocation, at some point you're going to have to take some chances to do it well. If you always wait for the perfect conditions, it's not going to happen. Even I had an experience like this. It talks about sowing your seed, right? And doing that in the morning, taking that chance. I had some patches in my lawn that didn't do so well this summer, and so I was talking to somebody else at the church, and they were talking about getting an aerator, and both of us maybe sharing that and doing some different spots in our yard and reseeding those this fall. And we decided, well, let's wait until it's about 60, 65 degrees as the high every day. Well, if you've been living in Idaho this fall, you know that never happened. 70s, 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 50s, 50s, 50s. It just skipped right over the 60s this year. So guess what? We never did it because we were waiting for those perfect conditions that didn't happen. And so this will come up in your work. Connected to that, it also is in that rest. Rest and work go together. And some of you need to show more risk in your work. Some of you need to risk by resting. Resting is an inherent risk. You have to put your work away and step away from it and trust it's going to be okay without me constantly working on it. I mean, I think there's something to this whole design that God gave us of He worked for 6 days and then He took a day off. I'm no strict Sabbatarian, but I do think that's a good idea, to take a day each week to put your work aside and to focus on other things. And even that's something you should do on a daily basis, putting your work aside to rest. It's a thing called sleep. Try it. It's good. God says in Psalm 127, God gives His beloved sleep. And it's actually in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest. You need to trust God and show that you trust God by being willing to rest. And so that's tied in with work. And number 7 is relationships. Really just godly Christian relationships where we are practicing the one another's. That's risky. Caring for other people, you are going to expose yourself to hurt and to pain and to loss if you genuinely open up your emotions to care for others. And that works so many ways, kind of from your end. If you're going to actually confess your sin to others, if you're going to be vulnerable to other people, that's risky. If you're going to care about others, even so much sometimes to speak the truth in love, and maybe that involves a bit of confrontation or exhortation to somebody else, that can feel risky. But those are good things, biblical things for us to do. So for those of you keeping score, serving, evangelism, giving, obedience, family, work, relationships are 7 ways to build these risk muscles, even on a consistent day-by-day, week-by-week basis. Because I can't say, well, hey, everybody, go out and risk your life this week for the gospel. Well, what exactly would that look like in our culture? But here's ways where, hey, you can be taking small risks to be faithful to Christ so that when something does happen, you're ready for that moment. Because we do need people to take more risks with their lives for the gospel. There are billions of unreached people on planet Earth. We need more missionaries. We need more people to say, here I am, send me. I'll go wherever to reach people for Christ. Some of you, you just bought a new house, and someday we're going to be saying, hey, why don't you sell that house to move somewhere else to be a part of a new church plant? Who's going to be willing to do that? We need more men with a desire to go into ministry, to be pastors and leaders in the church. Those are going to be risky things. Prepare yourself to make one of those bigger decisions by making all these smaller decisions this week. And you see the culture that we're living in. The cost of following Christ is going up and will continue to. And you may be at a point where it's, hey, following Christ might cost me my job, or maybe even cost me my life. But I'm ready to do that anyways, right? I'm ready to risk for the sake of Christ. And again, to be clear, that is the goal. It wasn't just, hey, he risked his life. No, he nearly died, verse 30, for the work of Christ. That's why he risked. It was for Christ. And again, that's the goal. We'll think this way. We'll take these sanctified risks when we can say, like Paul, for to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. My life is not about my career. My life is not about my family. My life is not about my friends or my hobbies. My life is about serving Jesus Christ. That's why I'm here. And when I die, it'll be gain because I get to go and be with him. That's how even this passage is connected to what we've seen in this whole book. But risk is scary, isn't it? I mean, I know most of you are like, yeah, there's a few of you out there that are like, I eat risk for breakfast. But I'm pretty sure you're the minority. Most people, yeah, I don't like risk. I don't like how that feels. And even today, if we said after the services, you go out front, we've got a leap of faith set up for you where you got to climb up on top of this pole and then jump out and try to grab on to this trapeze. And we've got two versions set up. The one on the left, you're making the leap over a pit of boiling hot lava. And then the one on the right is over a foam pit. Which one do you think is going to have the longer line? Now, again, there's probably a few of you sickos who are like, give me the lava, right? But most people are going to say, hey, if this doesn't go the way I planned, I would like a soft landing. Well, how does this connect to what we're talking about? Go back to our passage and look at verse 27. Look at verse 27. It's kind of in the midst of he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him. Even Epaphroditus' recovery. Paul doesn't credit medicine. He doesn't credit, well, he got to Rome and he was able to rest and he recovered. He gives credit to God's mercy. And frankly, I'm concerned we don't give enough credit to God's mercy in our world today, even when it comes to things like health stuff. He gives the credit to God's mercy, where we often, in a modern society, we think it's medicine or technology or whatever, or even if theologically, like me, you're saying, well, I don't see the gifts in the book of Acts as practiced by the apostles and prophets as normative for the church today. Well, one downfall of that is you can just start to discount God and his involvement in things. No, we need to give credit to the mercy of God. And that shows us when we risk for Christ, our exposure isn't really that exposed because it's covered by the mercy of God. We've got a safety net. When things don't go the way we planned it, we've got a soft landing in the mercy of God. Let's put this down for point number 3. Trust the safety net of God's mercy. Trust the safety net of God's mercy. If I take a risk for Christ, and if it doesn't go how I planned it to go, I know that God's got me. And he's not going to let me go. And again, I'm not talking about foolish risk of presumption like James 4 warns us about, or even how Satan tried to twist Scripture to tempt Jesus. Hey, jump off the foot of the temple, because didn't God say his angels would catch you? And Jesus says, no, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, right? That's not what we're talking about. But genuine, honest sacrifice and risk for Jesus. When you decide to do that, he will not leave you hanging. When you, in faith, because you think this is genuinely what you want to do to serve Christ, and you say, well, hey, I'm going to serve another night, or I'm going to give more money, or we're going to have another kid, or adopt, or foster, or I'm going to open my mouth and share the gospel, even though I'm not sure how this person will respond. When you do those kind of things in faith, God will not leave you high and dry. You will be landing in his mercy, no matter what happens, right? And that's something I even want us to see. One possible way we could twist this is to say, well, if I serve Christ, it will always work out. Because look, Epaphroditus didn't die, he got better. Well, we could go throughout church history and show you a lot of people that did die. And was it because they didn't have faith? No. Was it because God wasn't merciful? No, he was. But let's talk more about this. The idea is what motivates you to risk is I'm trusting God's mercy has got me. My risk is not that exposed. And you should be familiar with God's mercy, even that word that the Lord or God had mercy on him. A couple other places that's used really is used in reference to our salvation. In Romans 9 and 1 Peter 2. Really, even that, why are you saved and somebody else isn't? Well, the bottom line issue is God had mercy on you. And in 1 Peter 2, you used to not have mercy, but now you have received mercy. You should be familiar with God's mercy as a Christian. But let's think of a couple other familiar passages. Think of Psalm 23. You know, it starts with those idyllic, peaceful scenes. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. There's green pastures, there's still waters. Everything is fine. But then it moves on. Well, that mindset doesn't change even in the valley of the shadow of death. Even there, I will fear no evil, for your rod and your staff come from me. You are with me, David says. Even in the presence of my enemies, you prepare a table before me. It's in that context of hostility that David says, my cup overflows. And that's a good thing for us to think about even going into this week, where you've got some time set aside, even in our pagan society, for the giving of thanks. That's what David was. When things were good, when things were bad, my cup overflows. I'm giving thanks to God. You want to get good at taking risks? Get good at giving thanks. Because that will build that habit of I'm trusting God's mercy. I'm seeing God's mercy in the good. I'm thanking God for his mercy in the bad. And I know that surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Well, let's turn to one other passage, Romans chapter 8. Romans 8. Again, to clear up this idea that, well, if I take risks for Christ, they'll always go like I want them to. No, the Bible doesn't say that. In Romans 8 and verse 35, it says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? And it's not saying, hey, the love of Christ will keep you from all of those things. Because look at the next verse. As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Verse 37, no, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. No, this idea of God being merciful, it's not saying it will keep you from all of these bad things, but that God will love you and be merciful through these things. And that nothing, verse 38, for I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Nothing will separate me from the mercy of God. So I can take a risk, knowing that even if it blows up in my face for Christ, it can't separate me from his love. It can't separate me from his mercy. Because there is no guarantee that these risks will work out on an earthly level. Lots of martyrs in the early church. Hebrews 11 talks about people dying and being poor and wandering about in sheep's and goat skins and in caves and dens of the earth. But they had faith, and nothing could separate them from the love of God. one of the biggest reasons we have a very low risk tolerance as Christians is that we actually have a very low view of the love and mercy of God. That's a problem we need to realize, and we need to elevate our view of God's love and his mercy and the unending nature of those things. And we ask ourselves, are we risking anything actually? If we know nothing can separate me from the love of God, if I know that his mercy is going to follow me all the days of my life, well, what are we risking actually? Nothing can separate those things from me. In fact, kind of following the pattern of Epaphroditus, there was a group in the early church known as, they would call themselves the gamblers. And they would do things like visit prisoners, which we've already established was a risky thing when they were religious prisoners. Or they would visit the sick with, communicable diseases where they were putting themselves at risk. Because to use a gambling term, those people know I'm playing with house money here. I can't really lose because God's got me with his love and his mercy. Or to use another hero of the faith that you can read about there on the back of your worksheet, Jim Elliot, who he took a risk for Christ. And from a human perspective, it didn't go well. He was killed in the jungles of South America trying to bring the gospel to people that had never heard of Jesus. And he said these words, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." And if you want to risk this week, even to build those muscles this week, or when God calls you and puts you in that moment to risk your job or your life or your health or whatever it may be to honor Christ in that moment, this is the mindset you need to have. I'm ultimately confident in the love of Christ, in the mercy of Christ, and know that, hey, eternally, he's got me. Because even if I die, what we were saying earlier, the worst that may come, but shortens our journey and hastens us home, right? I'm not afraid of those things because I am confident in the love of Christ. And I hope that as we get more confident in the love of Christ, we'd see Jim Elliott's and Epaphroditus's rise up from our congregation. Let's pray.